Is a pleasure, sir. I'm Evan. We've never met. You're Otto, I take it?
Yes.
Liz said that you might be a very interesting person to talk to, and looking into it a little bit, sounds like it might be. So, tell me who you are.
Uh, well, I work as a janitor, but before that, I was briefly a middle school teacher, and before that, a university lecturer overseas for about 12 years. And I live in New Mexico, and I am right now trying to do the immigration paperwork to my wife over here.
Oh, cool.
So that she'll bring my daughter, who doesn't need any paperwork because she already has a U.S. passport. But
Right.
and last year, my fourth book was published by Ibidem Verlag out of Stuttgart and Hanover. It's an academic press in Germany that does books in German, English, Russian, and even French. But this one's in English, and
Cool.
called "The Years of Great Silence." It's about the Soviet government's treatment of its citizens of German ethnicity from in 1941 to 1955, mostly.
That is certainly a horror show of bad events, to be sure.
Yes.
Which, to be fair, that's oftentimes forgotten. So, well, I guess we can just kind of go in there. That being that we're missing out on a lot of history, even current history. Perfect example is Western reporting on the events as they've been unfolding in Ukraine. We're getting a very biased point of view.
I don't follow it anymore. I couldn't figure out if it was anything of truth behind the smoke screens.
And that's fair. That's fair. I mean, if you the Western narratives diverge entirely from the Eastern narratives, and then the final numbers we get don't exactly match up with either set. So you just really the only thing you can do is kind of take in both sets of data and try and draw your own conclusions from on the ground reporting as best you can get it. But that being said, it does look like the recent offensive, or I should say counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side has not done as well as was hoped, and has done quite poorly for those poor Ukrainian souls who are out there fighting. So we'll just we've been kind of reporting on that and watching it as it goes, because it's kind of such a pivotal geopolitical moment,
Certainly. I mean, the United States is about as involved in it as we were in Vietnam in about 1963. So we haven't landed in Odessa like Da Nang yet, but
I kind of pray that we don't, because this one has a lot nastier weapons to unleash if we invoke his ire. So anyway, let's hope we don't do that. So, your book there, that's your most recent?
yes, the Years of Great Silence. As I said, it was published last year. There's some different publication dates, but they're all between like March and May of 2022.
Okay. Well, would you be interested in giving us some noteworthy highlights? Maybe something, I guess, poignant, something that is very worth knowing that just hasn't really ever been mainstream reported.
Well, I mean, it's basically a narrative, primarily. I mean, the middle part deals with the events in the subtitle. So, the deportation, special settlement, and mobilization of the labor army. So the German population in the Soviet Union, starting in Crimea and then in the Volga and then other areas, was all forcibly deported internally into Siberia and Kazakhstan between August and December 1941. And they were placed under restrictions for their movement and surveillance called the Special Settlement Regime. And they were then, starting on 10th of January 1942, mobilized into forced labor, particularly the Labor Army, which were recruited as if they were Red Army soldiers and then turned over to the NKVD, People's Commissary of Internal Affairs, the political police, and sent to labor camps in the Gulag, mostly in the Urals, where they did industrial construction and felling of trees. There's some coal mines, although not in the Urals, one in Siberia, Krasnodar, and also in Kazakhstan and Karaganda.
Now that is one thing that I guess a number of people will be familiar with, the Gulag system of a Soviet state, I guess you'd say. Pardon.
Yeah, except they were in the camps, but they weren't prisoners, because they were never charged or sentenced or tried. It was basically a labor mobilization, induction, military style. And it was supposed to be for the duration of the war, but most of the surviving Labor Army conscripts were not released until 1948, so considerably after the end of hostilities with the Axis.
That's absolutely fascinating. 1946, you say?
48.
Oh, 48. Oh, wow, that's pretty. That's a pretty extensive time period to basically just be ruling a bunch of slaves.
6 years.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't indentured servitude, 7 years, so it's about the same.
Jeez. Kind of dark, but it's a pretty apt comparison. So I guess beyond that, what are your other books? Are they in the same vein?
Yeah, sort of. My first book, Stalinist Penal System, was basically on the Gulag, mostly collection of statistics from when it was running in the 1930s and 40s. The second book, Ethnic Cleansing in the USSR, is about a whole bunch of ethnic groups deported into either Kazakhstan and Central Asia or Siberia. So not just the Germans, but the chapter on them, but also Koreans, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Kalmucks. So it's a kind of a overview of the entire policy of national deportation. And then my third book was a short history, it's only about 100 pages, of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. So it's more broader, starting with the revolution in 1917 and going up to the end of the Soviet Union in 91. But by far, I think this is my best book. It's the one I've worked the most on. It's got a lot of archives from Moscow, which is something you can't access readily anymore as an American.
Oh, I'm sure.
Due to the war with Ukraine. It's got some archives from other places, Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, Tartu in Estonia, stuff from the U.S. archives on the forced repatriation of ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union in the U.S. occupation zone of Germany that were forcibly repatriated against their will, about 210,000 of them.
Oh, really? I believe I had heard of this. I had no idea the extent of it. That's a pretty...
Well, that's just the ethnic Germans that were Soviet citizens. Operation Keelhaul itself, much greater number of people forcibly sent back, in the millions.
Wow.
Because the agreement was at Yalta that any Soviet citizens found in American or British or French occupation zones were to be sent back to the Soviet Union. And this agreement was altered a little bit because the Soviet Union claimed the Baltic states and what is now Western Ukraine and Belarus, but were part of Poland. And the Allies rejected that. So Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Western Ukrainians were able to avoid forced repatriation back to the USSR. But ethnic Germans had already been Soviet citizens before 1939, did not have that option.
That explains some of the more odd stories of people running into trouble that you might hear, like maybe in the 70s and 80s. Moving around in Europe, I should say. Back when, the Soviet Union was really at, if not the height of its power, at a much more noteworthy peak than it was shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
So I guess how would we compare and contrast then the ethnic attitudes of the Soviet era with, the Russian Federation seemingly more friendly to its diaspora? At least as far as your personal opinion.
Towards with the German diaspora in the Russian Federation?
By and large, not even just Germans, maybe Kazakh.
In many ways, the Russian Federation continuing the nationality policy of the Soviet Union, but it's been moved back a step. So all the ASSRs, autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, in the Russian Federation got upgraded to republic status. Some of them quite autonomous, like Yakutia, which is the Sakha Republic, or the Volga Tatar Republic around Kazan, or after two wars, Chechnya in the south. But specifically with the Germans, there's about 400,000 left in the Russian Federation. And there had been, of course, at the end of the Soviet Union, about 800,000 in the Russian Federation, and then about 1 million in Kazakhstan. And there's about 200,000 left in Kazakhstan now. So the German government has been providing quite a bit of assistance in cultural affairs and build some basic infrastructure, things like libraries and whatnot, to the German communities in the Russian Federation. Most still in Western Siberia, where their forefathers, or I don't know if there's too many left alive that made the trip themselves, but the deportees in 1941. So Altai Krai, Novosibirsk Oblast, Omsk Oblast, these are the main regions of where ethnic Germans still live, and there's some in the Urals, but the Volga German settlements, they were not allowed to return there. There are some that have done so, but it's a very small number. I think 50,000. And at the time of the deportation, there was almost 500,000 ethnic Germans in the Volga German ASSR and the neighboring oblasts of Saratov and Stalingrad.
So I guess at least that particular demographic has decreased significantly then in the post-Soviet era.
It happens when the whole population gets loaded onto trains and transported thousands of kilometers eastward.
Yeah, and I suppose they don't have any particular draw when there's not an overarching, horrifying government dictating your every move. The times we find ourselves in, right? So, what got you out of teaching proper and into having an easier and probably simpler and more secure job than the one you had?
So, um, my last university job with the American University of Iraq Suleimania, which isn't much of a university. It's largely one of these deep state projects. But my contract was not renewed because I didn't go along with. I suspect I had to take it to court to find out why they specifically did not renew my contract, because the head of my department had recommended it be renewed, and then the newly appointed vice president, who had been appointed specifically just for 1 year to axe people, get rid of them, overrode his decision. But when I asked the reasons why, they wouldn't tell me, so I had to take them to court. I paid $700 for it, kept them in court almost 3 years. I didn't win, but during disclosure, their claim was I was a bad teacher because I lectured instead of having a seminar style with classes of 50 undergraduates who didn't do any reading. So I thought that was the only lecturer ever in the history of the world to be fired for lecturing.
Yeah, that does come across a little asinine to me.
So I was unemployed after that for a while. And I just kept sending out all kinds of applications. And I didn't even realize I was in Kyrgyzstan to renew my daughter's passport. And it's 12-hour difference there. So sending out all of these applications. And I got a invitation to do an interview, which was in the middle of my night, but I figured it would be good practice to teach history of the state of New Mexico, which I knew very little about, to middle schoolers. And so I did it, and the next day they hired me, and I figured I needed the money really badly, so I came over here and took the job. And I lasted 7 months before they asked me to resign with a fairly generous severance package. It was about ended up giving me 11 months salary of the 12 months of the contract. So by resigning on month 7, I only lost 1 month of pay.
Oh, that's pretty fair.
And then I was unemployed again, but not so long. So I had a really nice vacation with the big severance check I got from March to June, and when I was hired as a cashier at a grocery store. But you know, the problem with cashiers is getting enough hours. A lot of times you won't get 40 hours a week, and so I complained about this. And when the morning janitor quit, they immediately offered it to me and said, "We'll give you this job at 40 hours guaranteed." And so I took it.
Yeah, it's one of those jobs that people look down on, and they don't really understand that, like, you're one of the underpinning things that makes everything just kind of go. Like, you've got to have people doing these jobs everywhere. I mean, the fact that I'm kind of poor about doing it in my own home really shows.
Yeah. Well, it was not something I would have suspected I would have done, but I really have kind of acclimated to it because it goes very fast, and you don't have to worry about possible negative interactions with other people. Let's put it that way, to kind of cover the whole broad spectrum of somebody else yucking your day. So yeah, it's fits my temperament fine. I just wish it paid more.
Oh, well, that's fair. That's fair. I fully appreciate that too, where you're coming from. I worked a lot of ridiculous, stressful jobs for a long time, and then I tried a delivery job, and well, it's just enough, and I get to drive around and listen to music, so it's enough to keep my head in the game all the time instead of worrying about things I shouldn't be.
Well, I mean, actually, if it was just me, uh, the low pay would be enough because the expenses aren't that high here. The problem, of course, as I alluded to earlier, I have dependents. So
Indeed, a family will add a whole nother factor into that equation. That's for sure.
this is true. But on the other hand, I'd probably be a very miserable person if I didn't have my daughter. So yeah. It's one of those things that is beyond money.
No, that's what I understand. Anyone with kids who actually cares about them is probably just going to say that they mean the world to them, and they wouldn't do anything to be without them. So well, man, I had something I was meaning to ask. Oh yeah. Are you familiar with the film Office Space?
Yes.
It, I think the situation kind of feels a little reminiscent of that. You know, you go from the day-to-day grind to just a decent physical labor job, and you know, you find your mind is actually free to actually think on things again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. The teaching middle school was the the discipline is completely gone. So I hadn't
So
had any real.
what was your tenure, or what was not your tenure so much? What were the specific years you were teaching there at the middle school?
Well, seventh grade mostly. So we're talking mostly 12-year-olds.
No. Like the actual year it was.
Oh, 2021 to 2022.
Oh, wild! So you got to see. Well, then I guess the next question is your thoughts on how modern education is being handled as opposed to.
Oh, it's awful. It's
Yeah,
awful.
I've seen. A
And the
few
big
horror
thing
stories.
is, I mean, I would say the biggest problem is actually not the teachers, and this might come uh, against a lot of people's belief, but certainly not the teachers union, because the NEA for me on the local level just kept me out of trouble. It worked as like an old school hard hat labor union, you know, defend the worker against the evil bureaucrats at all costs.
Fair.
So I had them on my speed dial. But the teachers I knew actually were politically fairly conservative in the history teaching.
Hmm.
I don't know about the other departments, but I do know. But you know, there's all of these laws that are passed about things you have to do that come from the state, central, you know, from Santa Fe, and then a lot of the parents, they have like no discipline or, you know, installation of respect, particularly respect for learning into their children. So, you know, you're basically, it's like Lord of the Flies.
I've actually heard it described exactly like that. That especially in your larger metros too. That a lot of the.
I'm not even in a larger metro. I mean, I was fortunate in that there was no like serious, you know, violence, and I didn't come across any drug use, but just the general lack of any type of discipline, not sitting down, not being quiet, not doing what they're told, throwing stuff on the floor. That type of stuff was just constant.
So, yeah, just I guess more the low level, not so much bad acting, just kids being kids that had never been taught how to learn. I guess.
Yeah, you know, and
I think it might be a symptom, kind of the system itself falling apart, not just at that particular stage, but earlier too. Just
Right, but see, this is the thing. I had been overseas for 12 years, so I was kind of unfamiliar with what had happened to American youth in that time. Not to mention, it's been quite some time since I was in middle school in 1982.
right, of course.
Yeah, 82 and 83. So things have changed quite a bit since then. But also, I just had no training. When you get your PhD in the British system, I went to the School of Oriental Africa, University of London, right? Day one, you start writing the dissertation, and you have 3 years to research and write it and get it approved. I did mine in 2 years, but this kind of American style of taking 10 years to find what you want to write about doesn't exist in the UK. So, but there, on the other hand, then there is none of this extraneous activity. So almost no students in the British system actually are TAs because they're just not there long enough.
Oh, okay. So it's
Well, the 3 years is normal for a PhD. 4 is the absolute max. They'll cut all your funding off.
oh, okay. So that's much more
Yeah,
much more concentrated than here. If you were to try,
right.
I don't
Yeah,
think you
and
can
I did
get
mine
a
in
PhD
2.
in
I
less
did
than
my
4.
doctorate in 2 years.
Well, that's sounds impressive to me.
You would think, but when you apply then to American schools, they say, well, you did your doctorate in 2 years, and this guy did it in 10 years. His must be 5 times better. Well, I'm thinking, no, I did it in 1/5 the time. I'm 5 times faster. That's got to count for something.
It's like, have you never seen a race between two people? That means I did better.
Yeah, but that's not how it's interpreted
my.
in the U.S. There is, in point of fact, a unwritten law that, except for Oxford and Cambridge, pretty much, they do not value British PhDs nearly as much as American ones.
I can't say I'm entirely surprised by that. It sounds, we'll just say silly, and silly is an American hallmark. Oh my! So I guess the silliness of modern education. Then, did you? Well, no. I guess you would have come in just a bit after Common Core. Are you at all familiar with that system?
I don't remember that. A lot of the stuff had already been solidified into the curriculum under different local names or state names. So whatever the Department of Education has, when it gets approved, then by the Public Education Department in Santa Fe, it might be renamed, even if it's verbatim the same.
Let me see if I can find an answer real quick.
So,
It looks like, yeah, it does look like Common Core standards were adopted there. So that would explain a few other things. I was never really a fan of how standardized they were trying to make the education system with that, because people are such different learners. Taking aside.
Oh, I gotta tell you, this is they have a law in New Mexico that you cannot have separate classes for the special education students. They have to be integrated to avoid stigma. So I had one class, and this wasn't my worst class, but and it was actually one of my better classes because I had a special education teacher to assist me. But I had 10, let's say, special students. Ones that are not either cognitively or some other reason not doing as well as should be expected. And I had initially 3 gifted students in that class, and then the rest were normal, but normal seems to have declined what we can expect from the 100 IQ students. So I have like the three radically different groups in terms of abilities. I mean, I had three people that were smarter than I was, but had no interest in the subject and put no effort in it. And then I had 10 students that really struggled. Some were hard workers that tried to make up for it. Others, just like the majority of the 100 or so average IQ students, just weren't interested in it either.
That's really unfortunate.
And I thought it was exciting material. I mean, I read a couple books when I first got here. And so, we did the Spanish conquistadors. We did the wars between the Spanish and the various Indian populations. We did the conflict between the incoming Anglos, Mexican Revolution, Mexican-American War, a whole big thing on the Civil War in the West, which was decided in New Mexico. A bunch on the wars against the Navajos and the Apaches, particularly the last one with Geronimo was the leader. And these students, or pupils, I guess, had absolutely no interest in any of it.
That's really unfortunate. At the very least, a lot of the various Indian wars and just conflicts with American Indians are really interesting and kind of.
I thought if you can't be interested in Geronimo, regardless of which side you're on, you're lacking imagination. And along with Shamil in the Caucasus, who held off the Imperial Russian Army for a quarter of a century, and Vo Nguyen, who defeated first the French and the Americans, and then the Chinese finally in Vietnam. He's probably one of the three greatest military minds we have in recent history.
I could believe that. I don't have enough research into it as I
Well, he had about 25 to 40 guys, and he kept off for decades both the Mexican and the U.S. Army.
Oh, that's pretty. That's pretty baller, I gotta say.
But yeah, and then of course I covered Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County Wars, and there was still no interest in that. And then right after the Spanish-American War, so we hadn't gotten to World War I yet, they asked me to resign. But I had given up anything. I was figuring my last big hope was going to be the space aliens in Roswell. But since the witch trials under the Spanish Inquisition didn't generate much interest, I wasn't holding out hope.
I hate to hear that. As personally, history was one of my favorite areas of study, especially in middle school. But not so much especially in middle school, especially in high school. But I had my interest peaked in middle school, and I did maybe a little bit of independent research. Just read some history books in and of themselves, and then in high school, I had a really influential social studies teacher that, shared a lot of really worthwhile history with me. Things that I wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. We watched Reefer Madness in his class. That's real American ephemera. That's like the heart and soul of America at that era. There's things you can miss even today if you can't appreciate where this has all come from.
Yeah. Well, I got in trouble for showing the advertisement with Iron Eyes Cody, where he's the Indian saying "Don't litter."
Oh yeah,
because I wanted the kids to stop throwing stuff on the floor.
Oh sure.
Yo quiero el piso muy limpio, por favor. And I got in trouble with the Central for that because I was supposedly shaming the kids into not littering. I couldn't use shame as a tool.
That is atrocious. Because I'll tell you, shame is a great thing. It works. Nobody gets hurt. We can establish societal standards that work and respect other human beings and their rights. Or, we can, just close down all the mental institutions and empower.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing. I mean, as an ex-middle school teacher, if you could, and I know it takes resources, and a lot of people don't have a lot of financial resources, but I would recommend homeschooling the kids. Not because all the teachers are bad, like you see on the Twitter. Like I said, most of the people that were teaching history where I was are fairly conservative. But with the other students, you only need like 4 bad students in a class of 30 for there to be no learning by anybody.
Yeah.
And so if you want your kids to actually learn stuff, if they're one-on-one and they can quietly read and you can quietly explain it to them, they're better than if they can't get that at all. Which is, I mean, I was a lousy teacher because I didn't have any background or training for it, but there's plenty of people that were better than me that have also left the education. And I would say that right now, it's like the only reason it hasn't collapsed is because the people that are still there, they have like some sort of magic abilities almost to handle these things. But, that's not a lot of people. So, I don't think it can last at its current trajectory.
Yeah, things are, you could say, tenuous. I have a cousin, as a matter of fact. He's a really passionate guy. He teaches at a vocational school. So, this is the kids that weren't able to make it. It's a vocational high school. So okay. These are the kids that weren't able to really quite make it in, the regular mainline school. And oftentimes it's not that they're any less smart. It's that they've never been engaged in ways that allow them to flourish. They're given a lot of these standardized practices and...
Right, but that's not the teachers.
Oh,
the standardized is coming from it's coming from the state departments of education. That's why I say I want to separate this. I mean, obviously, all the ideological stuff exists a little bit on the fringe, but I think the main problem is, it's become impossible for anybody but the very most talented people in this to maintain discipline among students now.
I can believe that. That's he really has to approach his students in a different way. The way he's described it is just that he's got to be a lot more respectful to them, but well, complicated, as said. I mean, you have to be respectful, but you have to be firm. You have to provide the shoulder maybe that these kids aren't getting to cry on. I mean, it's
again, this is all stuff that is not content orientated, right? And the people that were immediately above me, the principal and the assistant principal, were quite good. Mm-hmm. But I think they kind of let themselves be misled, because when I would interview them in Kyrgyzstan, right, the whole thing was on, well, would you be capable of being able to adapt to, multicultural environment, to the about half the students are Hispanic. And I said that, well, I've taught in Africa, I've taught in the Middle East, I've taught in Central Asia. That's not a problem. I speak some Spanish. I can learn it better once I arrive in New Mexico. But that wasn't my problem. Actually, the students who were children of actual immigrants that had come from Mexico were quite good. And my problem was that my American culture, so Anglos and Anglicized Hispanics, had greatly deteriorated in my absence. So if I had gotten a job teaching in Mexico, Mexican students, that would have been fine because they would have been disciplined and respectful. But I got it in the U.S. Where the youth culture of all races is become quite, let's say, hostile to learning.
From what I can gather, from my I guess high point of view, it certainly seems that way. And we've got another viewer. Hey, what's up? Thanks for tuning in. So, I guess the next thing then is, can we feasibly fix this? Is this something that we could do something
As I told
about
you,
in a generation?
From my observation from the inside for 7 months, my advice would be for parents to homeschool their kids. But
I would echo that.
Obviously, I know.
Honestly,
I do know why there, particularly among the working class people, there's resistance to it because you either have to have somebody work part-time instead of full-time, reducing your income for the household, or you have somebody that is full-time not working. And unfortunately, the days where you had the man salary large enough to support a wife and multiple kids and make house payments and car payments are long gone.
Unfortunately, they are. Ever since a whole another demographic was able to get into the workforce, the wages keep
right.
going
But
down.
ideally, if you had a wife with, you wouldn't need to be super educated, but if you had just a bachelor's degree, that would be fine for teaching however many children she had, 2 to 6. We're not talking 30.
Sure.
Or 40 pupils. We're talking a manageable number and people that she has direct discipline over in a way that does not exist in public education for many years now.
Or you could even say there's litigation and laws in place to avoid.
Oh, there's all kinds of reasons, but I think if you can do it. So I know a woman that I work with. She works part-time so that she can homeschool her kids, and her husband works full-time, but their household is not particularly wealthy. Basically, a working-class family that's just getting by. But it was important to them to not have their kids exposed to all the garbage from other kids in the public schools. I think that's a huge problem. Before you could crack down on these things, but now you can't crack down on anything.
No, that makes sense. Are you familiar with the concept of homeschooling pods?
Yeah, I heard about it. Where you hire like a private tutor to teach the subjects like math or foreign language to a number of
like it might
neighborhood
be
children.
Yeah, like a neighborhood school, you might say, as opposed to a homeschool.
Right, it would be like 3 or 4, 5. Yeah,
and sometimes, as you've mentioned, maybe one person with a bachelor's degree has adequate, learning to at least get the basics, the reading, writing, and arithmetic to a young group. You can. It's genuinely
to be honest. I don't think you need much more. I mean, it might be a little bit more sophisticated in the honors and AP classes in high school. But when I was teaching middle school, my PhD, of course, is in Asian history. But I only read a couple of books, and it seemed like I knew more about the history of New Mexico than most New Mexicans. But
That's funny and sad in its own way, but unsurprising. There's too much ignorance of history these days, and it is all too apparent in the actions that so many people take.
But perhaps the worst thing about it, as far as the general trend, is that as bad as the kid discipline is, it's hard to really blame 12 and 13-year-olds for them not having proper guidance at home.
I mean, sometimes you honestly have to be impressed that these kids have made it as far as they have in a system that's so debased and degenerated, really. I mean, it's kind of hard to get ahead when the system's built against you.
Yeah, well, as I said, that if you can, and you may have to make sacrifices, I would homeschool kids, even if obviously you're not an expert on all the subjects covered. If you can cover the subjects without disruption from other pupils, then you're way ahead.
Oh, yeah. Your kids are already going to have an advantage of just having attentive people ensuring that they're getting the lessons, even if they aren't the best teachers. Just being outside of that environment will make a world of difference. And as a matter of fact, just to be completely honest, on this show, we have oftentimes endorsed homeschooling. So, you are amongst friends here.
Well, I'm not endorsing it because, I do it. My daughter is currently with her mother. As I said, I'm trying to get them over, but she's in a private school overseas. But the reason I say is I just think that's probably the best option. And it's probably the cheapest option, although, as I noted, it's not actually all that cheap. It's one parent has to give up at least working part-time, but that's the sacrifice you probably have to make due to failures. And again, I think I'm mostly on the level of the state governments. You get these education bureaucrats and politicians that are, I don't know, but they have this. The ideas don't really work in practice. Like the idea that we have to have these, we can't segregate the special education students from normal students and gifted students because that would be stigmatizing. It's almost like these people heard, well, segregation was bad when we did it on the basis of race before abolishing Jim Crow. It must be bad when we do it everywhere for any reason. And no.
Yeah, that right there has been one of the biggest failures of the modernized education system that we've seen. Putting gifted students in with regular students and putting special ed students in with regular students.
Well, I had them all three in the same classes.
Oh, yeah, and then to mix all three, you've put your lowest common denominator that you have to meet pretty damn low when you're going like that. And I mean, I can see how you would have trouble engaging these kids.
Yeah. So,
that's a tragedy.
But when they offered my resignation, and I left the school district on very good terms with them. I said, you're right, I didn't do a very good job of this because I had no background, and if you want me to resign, I will resign. I find your severance offer very generous. I did my union rep, so she was there constantly with me.
Fair.
And I said, I'll return. I had a couple of textbooks out the next morning, and I did. And so I don't have any problems with my former bosses there, although I'm not going to work in K through 12 education ever again anywhere.
Fair.
And I was frustrated with the kids, but the parents were always worse. And not even all the parents, but just enough to ruin everything. You just have to put one piece of shit in the soup.
Oh yeah, that it just takes one to ruin the whole pot.
So I'm very happy to be free of that. As when they asked me, when I signed the resignation, and I think I put on my Twitter, as they call it termination, I call it liberation.
Absolutely. Yes, your sentence has been terminated.
But again, I mean, it wasn't a hostile. I think they were very generous in their severance. As I said, I only missed 1 month, and I only worked 7, so I got paid for 11 months of work.
Hey, that's pretty fair. If they take care of you, I guess you can't really complain as far as.
No, I'm not complaining about their removal of me, or actually any of the people in the administration. But as I said, the laws coming down from Santa Fe, the lack of discipline in many households, and I have very few black students. My students were about half white, half Hispanic, but I had plenty of dysfunctional Anglo and Hispano students coming from dysfunctional Anglo and Hispano families. So it's not limited to just African Americans. This type of dysfunction that we associate with the inner city. And I'm in a small town, and
oh no, a great deal of that really
we're
is
half
city.
White, half old Hispano, and neither of those groups are maintaining the type of standards they used to have.
Well, that's really so much of it. I mean, I don't know if you would say so much the collapse of these support groups that have existed in segments of society, or just the controlled demolition of them. Even honestly, you could argue, but a lot of that, I think, kind of ties to the lack of ties, the communities falling apart. I wouldn't feel uncomfortable arguing that.
Yeah, but I think it's something for white Americans to keep in mind. You can look at how bad things are in black communities, but if you compare white communities today to the 1950s, right, it's not as steep a decline or degeneration, but it's along the same trajectory.
No, but there is that same effort to remove the father from the family, and I'll tell you, if they can.
Well, I had some students. I had one student I know who his father had been in jail, prison, so he was white.
Mm-hmm.
Not
I'm sure
Hispanic.
you might have noticed the very same kind of issues we see with other fatherless individuals. It's tragic.
Right. So I put that out there because when it comes down to it, white people are the worst enemies of white people. I mean, it's not that we don't have problems with the other racial groups, but if we could solve our own problems internally, it would make very little difference because we'd be strong enough and not have the type of internal rot that we wouldn't really have to worry what outsiders thought or did.
Truly. I mean, in that, you can actually look at kind of the Mexican, family units and community. They're a lot tighter knit, and they've managed for that to maintain a lot more of their natural cultural identity, despite so many.
But there's also been a lot of degeneration. I mean, the former state historian Tony Torres for New Mexico has a great essay about growing up in Taos And he starts it and says, we were an old school Hispano community that spoke the Spanish of Cervantes and practiced medieval Catholicism. And then Dennis Hopper and the hippies showed up and ruined everything, you know. But there is some truth to the fact that, after '69 or so, we go into the '70s and '80s and '90s, the kind of traditional cultures, not just of Anglo-Americans, but also long-settled Hispano communities started to disintegrate under the pressure of modernism, or however you want to call it, modernity.
Modernity, in addition, globalization. I think the muddying of all the cultures. Really, how could you say?
Well, it always surprises me. I come across people who are obviously Hispanic because of their name, and they don't speak a word of Spanish. And I'm like, wait, because I grew up in California, where somebody has a Spanish name. They generally speak Spanish because they're generally from Mexico or further south, as far as where they were born and raised. But here you have a lot of deculturized,
and not just amongst Mexicans. You'll see that a lot amongst Asians, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese. That
we don't have many here, and almost all of the Asian population. We have some from China, but vast majority of the Asian population here are Filipinos. But they were born in the Philippines and grew up there for the most part. So they're not a long-standing community the way the some of the Hispanos, they can trace their origins here back to the 15th century. They've been here for longer than many of the English-speaking settlements in the East Coast.
No, I can believe that. No, I think there was something else I was wanting to go over. Okay, we got your 3 books, 4 books, right?
4 books. Yeah, I've had 4 books, but the important one, the one that I'm pushing now is The Years of Great Silence. It's $42. The distributor is Columbia University Press. So if you go to their website, it'll have the book available for delivery in the United States and Canada. If you are in Europe, then you should go to the IBIDIM Verlag website, which is available in both German and English, and they should be able to ship it to you. The one place is kind of problematic because it's neither in the European Union anymore or in North America is Great Britain. You probably have to get it from Amazon.uk.
Okay, and for anybody watching or listening to this after the fact, I'll have links to that available for you below if you'd like to check that out. As well, of course, to Otto here, if you'd like to follow him on Twitter. Oh, and yes, I did remember what I was wanting to get. Are you familiar with Mystery Grove Publishing?
They did the
Wrangle.
The Memoirs of Wrangle. A little bit.
Not so much them to bring it up, just that they're a bit infatuated with Wrangle in that particular era of of Russian history. So I thought I'd actually ask you your thoughts on Peter Wrangle.
Well, Peter Wrangle was the Tsarist military officer. He's from the Baltic German family from what is now Estonia. Estland is the Baltic province. And then, of course, the Baltic Germans, despite being only about 200,000 at the end of the Russian Empire, and descendants of people who came with the Teutonic Knights, although not the actual Teutonic Knights themselves, because they were supposed to be celibate as monks. But a lot of other fighters, mercenaries, brought in by the Teutonic Order, Hanseatic League type of merchant class, burghers in the cities. So they pretty much dominated both landowning and commerce, as well as education. University of Tartu used to be a University of Dorpat in what is now Estonia. It's still the Estonian National University, but at one time it was a German university, and even had a Lutheran seminary in it. So the Lutheran population, not only of Estonia and Latvia, but also the Volga Germans, mostly Lutheran. Some other German communities descended of colonists coming after 1804 with the Second Manifesto by Alexander the First. They were Lutheran, so the seminary provided the training for their priest. They would go to Estonia and then back to the Volga or wherever. Daughter colony was Siberia after 1904, for instance. So Wrangel was part of this kind of elite, and they had a lot of officers and chinoviki, which I guess is bureaucrat in the civil service of the Tsarist government. But they also, when the Bolsheviks took power, a lot of them sided with the whites. So Wrangel took over from Denikin, who was head of the Army of the South, and fighting against the Bolsheviks. But by the time, and there was a time when Denikin was almost successful in marching on Moscow, but by the time Wrangel took control of it, it was pretty much a lost cause. He's most famous for organizing the evacuation of some of the white forces and their families out of Crimea into the Ottoman Empire. And those that were not evacuated, and the numbers, of course, vary, but they were all ruthlessly killed by the Bolsheviks. And the man directing those massacres was Bela Kun, who had been part of the briefly lived communist government in Hungary after World War I.
Interesting. So it does seem that communism has a bloody history that goes back long before the both of us. Unsurprising to anyone of learning. But that said, yourself, obviously you're already familiar with the man, but to anyone checking this out, I would recommend Mine War of Trouble and Always with Honor. The Always with Honor, I would say, certainly your first one to check out. That's Peter Wrangel's personal memoirs, and he's an interesting man, and he did what he could to save as many lives as he could. And that's, well, I mean, that's always, what's the word I'm looking for? Honorable, I guess?
Yes, I guess. Yeah, I don't think there's really any. I mean, a lot of the German communities, kind of survived a little bit in exile back in Germany through the Landmannschaften. But it's not. I don't think there's much to the Baltic Germans. Those from Estonia and Latvia. Most of them were evacuated by the German government. During the 1940, I believe, after the Soviets took them over, or maybe just before, but after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and before the Operation Barbarossa. But I get the feeling that most of them kind of just assimilated into Germany proper, because unlike some of the Volksdeutsche groups, they weren't very big. So the Sudeten Germans are like 3.5 million people expelled into Bavaria and Austria. As I said, there were never more than 200,000 Baltic Germans.
No, then I don't suppose it would be the greatest ask for such a group to assimilate.
Well, I mean, they're already Germans.
Right. Yeah, it's like Germans
and
to one other
and
side.
they're already German elite, as it were. So I mean, I don't think you know it's the same dynamic as what you see with the expellees from particularly what was the countries that came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you see the Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia. You see the Donau Schwaben from Yugoslavia, most of them forced out actually in the 1950s. So these groups, I think, kind of maintain a more distinct difference from general German population than the Baltic Germans do now. But I've seen almost nothing on what happened to the Baltic Germans after they were evacuated to Germany. It's just like, okay, they went back to Germany, and that's the end of the history for the Baltic Germans.
One has to wonder if that's a distressing or comforting answer.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I only met one person. She was quite old. I met her in Canada, but she was one of the ethnic Germans in Latvia, the Baltic Germans that were evacuated which this happened when she was a small child. So it may be just that the descendants of, we're, been in Germany now 2-3 generations, and we were always German. So, the connection with Estonia and Latvia is not so important.
No, that would certainly not be a reach. Well, I guess we've covered a couple of very interesting topics. Was there anything that you'd like to get across to my audience, or anything that we haven't talked about?
I don't. I don't know. I mean, most of my academic writing has been on Soviet repression of ethnically targeted groups deported in their entirety into either Siberia or Kazakhstan and Central Asia, or sometimes both. And particularly the ethnic Germans, and then probably the next most written about group for me would be Crimean Tatars. Well, I've also written some on Koreans and Kurds. I taught, as I said, at American University Iraq Suleimania, which is in the Kurdish region. I think only about 10% of the population there is Arab. The rest are Kurds mostly.
I guess there's a question I could ask in that line then. What are your thoughts to the... I know it's largely... I think it's largely Syrians that hold the thought that there is, quote, no such thing as a Kurd.
Well, I'm not sure. So Iraq, there is a Kurdish autonomous region. It has 3 vilayets, or Dohuk, which is a very nice small city up on the border with Turkey. And then Erbil, which is where the capital is in the middle, and has the citadel, which I believe is the oldest continuously inhabited building on the planet.
Oh, that's cool.
It's a huge building. It's like a mini city fortress, from ancient times in Mesopotamia. But there's always been people living in it, and since it was built. So we're talking millennia. And then in the south, where I was, Suleimania is a fairly recent city. It was built in the 18th century. Kind of bulwark against Iran to the east, Persia then.
Sure.
But it's where I was for 3 years. So they have a recognized autonomous zone, and they pretty much have a lot of internal autonomy, and they show Kurdish symbols, the Kurdish flag rather than the Iraqi flag usually. Kurdish language is the official language for all government and education. So in that area, I guess the Iraqi Kurds are definitely have recognition as a separate group. In Syria, of course, in Rojava they call it, as opposed to Iraq is Bashur. So Bashur is south, Rojava is west. Bakur in Turkey is north, and then Rojava east in Iran. The old policy under the first Assad was that the Kurds in Syria that had come to what is now Syria, because they didn't cut up the Ottoman Empire till after World War I, right? From what is now Turkey, Bakur, that they and their descendants were to be stripped of Syrian citizenship. So this removed citizenship and rights to things like free medical care and education and whatnot that provided by the Syrian state to those Kurds. All right, so only the Kurds that could prove they were descended from Kurds in what is now Syria and did not come from across what was now the border. So right, a lot of Kurds fled the Turkish Republic into this French protectorate of Syria during the 1920s and 30s. So that policy existed. I'm not sure they ever said there was not such thing as a Kurd, but
I guess what I'm saying there is a kind of a more popular thought, kind of the. I'm referencing something that's kind of similar in thought that you'll see in some really extreme Israelis saying there's no such thing as Palestine, that kind of thing. Whether it's true or not, I guess a way of thinking, if I'm making myself clear to you.
Yeah, well, see, I haven't been to Syria. I've only
nor I. I just have some
the only Kurdish
Syrians.
The only Kurdish populations I have come in contact with are those in Kyrgyzstan, where I used to live, those in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I did a conference on Kurds in Russia and the Soviet Union in Moscow, and met a number of Kurds with Russian Federation citizenship, Kurds that descended of people that were taken into the Russian Empire in the 19th century from either the Ottoman Empire or the Persian Empire. And there were a bunch of Kurds from the Turkish Republic there in Moscow. And to be frank, the Kurds in Russian Federation, the Kurds in the Turkish Republic, their scholarship is infinitely better than anything Kurds in Iraq are doing.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, the Soviet Union was always a center for Kurdish studies, particularly in Yerevan, in the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Huh. I was totally unaware of that. That's interesting. Well, since we're in the area, I have one kind of interesting left field question for you. Thoughts on Göbekli Tepe? Are you familiar? In Turkey, the Göbekli Tepe site.
You're talking about I haven't been there. The only places in Turkey I've been are Istanbul and Ankara. Of course, you could spend your whole life in Istanbul and not even scratch the surface. So
it is a capital city.
Well, I mean, it's huge and it goes back quite a long time by American standards. I mean, so if you like Byzantine Greek stuff, I mean, that's a great place to go if you're into the architecture and the history of the Byzantines.
Well, there's some rock and rollers once wrote a song about that. It used to be Constantinople, they say.
Yes. Yeah, and there still actually is the really only place still a Greek population in Istanbul.
Yeah, I understand they have some of the oldest Christian populations in the world there as well.
Uh, Perhaps I would have thought that Bethlehem would have the oldest, but
Well, I say some of the oldest. Yeah, I would imagine the Coptic Christians probably to be truly the
the
oldest.
Copts in Egypt maybe. Well, they say the first state to have an official conversion to Christianity was Armenia,
Hmm.
and then the second, I believe, was Ethiopia,
Oh,
and
that's
then the Byzantines.
Ethiopia the second. I didn't know that either. But then again, I guess I would expect a little bit more scholarly leanings from a fellow like yourself. So
Well, if you look at, I mean, the Red Sea between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, particularly Eritrea and Djibouti, it's not that far. So you can make a boat trip pretty easily. But, supposedly the last emperor of Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, line of Judah, was a direct descendant of King Solomon and Queen Sheba. So Queen Sheba is mentioned as the matriarchal monarch of Ethiopia in the Old Testament.
and to be sure, Haile Selassie has some wild tales. He was a wily leader, to be sure.
This is true, and um, but
The Great Jaw, if you like.
yes, but I mean, I'm not an expert in Ethiopia, but one of the things that I do hear over and over again is that Haile Selassie was a bit too reactionary and particularly inflexible for his
From
own
my
good.
from my own minor understanding of his exploits, that tracks.
So one of the things that kept Ethiopia back, that the communists, of course, made even worse somehow, was the kind of irrational land tenure system, which was actually in some ways similar to the Russian Mir, that you had these strips of land that weren't connected with each other necessarily, being so you'd have a strip of land that you would plow, and then you'd go past 3 or 4, 5, 6 different strips of land owned by other people or used by other people, usufruct, not ownership. And then you have another strip of land you would plow, and this was highly inefficient.
Oh, yes, quite. I can only imagine.
Um, but there's also, I mean, it's not the only example, but it's a good example. Many of the communists that took power in Ethiopia in 1974 and have quite a brutal red terror in, I believe it's 77 to 78 in Ethiopia. And then, of course, the famine and the forced relocation of people in the 80s. But many of the communists in the 74 quote unquote revolution, they had gotten their university education, their intellectual training, as it were, in the United States.
I can't say I find that tremendously surprising. That's
So,
it's been all too common for all too long.
And so, it's one of these things where it doesn't, not a colonial power like France and Indochina, but certainly the United States had kind of a big brother relationship with Ethiopia under Haile Selassie going back to 1935 with the Italian invasion. And Emperor Haile Selassie was the first foreign leader to ever address the U.S. Congress.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that at all.
Yes. It was a lot of support for the Ethiopians against the Italians among the intellectual class in Harlem, which ironically, much of them were descendant of recent Jamaican, the kind of very high literate class in Harlem at that time.
That's kind of funny. That's kind of funny. I won't lie.
I mean, probably the biggest black nationalist intellectual in the 1920s was Marcus Garvey, who was from Jamaica.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And he was in Harlem during that time to promote his Back to Africa movement, but he himself never got back to Africa. Unlike me, where I was in West Africa for almost 6 years.
I've got a few friends who have done some traveling and some aid work down in Africa, and they really generally don't have anything but good things to say about the people.
Well, I was fortunate. I got a position teaching in the history department at the University of Ghana. So Ghana, in many ways, is atypical of much of sub-Saharan Africa.
Isn't Ghana the one that's basically doing it all right, and they're pretty
Well,
much
every
just
so often, but they keep doing the currency wrong forever, so it's never gonna be permanent. They do a lot of things wrong, but they get a lot of good press because they do some things right. But they do have, for urban areas compared to most of Africa and even a lot of places outside of Africa, United States, Latin America, even parts of London, Manchester, a very low urban crime rate. And this is especially true if you're a noticeable foreigner, at least a noticeable white foreigner. I'm not sure if Chinese gets the same respect, but so that makes it easy to travel because, people say, well, if you go to Johannesburg, your chances of, and my boss, who was a Ghanaian, was almost killed in Johannesburg because criminals heard his accent and said, well, this guy's not South African. He should be an easy mark. We can kill him and take his money.
That's certainly a little.
You don't have that in Accra, which is the capital and largest city of Ghana. You might get pickpocketed at Makolo Market, but the chances of being a victim of violent crime, I think, in Accra is much less than Memphis or South Chicago or Philadelphia or many U.S. cities. I never heard of anybody I knew personally. And there was a story after I left Ghana that got a lot of press about two white girls. I think they were from Switzerland, but somewhere in Europe, I think, that were raped. But I think it got so much press because it was unusual. Whereas in South Africa, that's a daily occurrence.
Two girls get raped in South Africa. You're not even going to bother printing it in the paper.
Well, it's not that rape doesn't exist in Ghana. I said the crime rate is relatively low compared to most urban areas.
Oh yeah, no,
particularly
I
in Africa.
It's just it's a standout, and in amongst its surroundings, it's a standout above that too.
Yeah, well, because Nigeria has got all kinds of problems too, and Nigeria has a lot of similarities in that they were both former British colonies. English is still the unifying language of both countries. Obviously, like in the Soviet Union, it turns out the same in Africa. If you have two different tribes, the minority tribe would rather that they speak English than be forced to speak the majority tribe's language.
I suppose that makes sense.
So when this is obviously simplified because there's no country with just two tribes. There's like countries have 200 tribes, right?
Sure.
So you see in Ghana, the official language by law is English. So all education and government services must be offered in English. And my church services, there were two of them. So the first one in the morning was in English, and the second one was actually split between two local languages. Almost everybody could speak English, either as a second or sometimes a third language.
Well, that's fascinating. Probably imagine that would be fairly useful internationally as well.
It makes it very easy for Americans to travel there, because you don't need to learn another language. So my Twi, which is what the Asante speak, but it's the The second language so most Ghanaians will speak their ethnic language. So say somebody from the Volta region over by Togo, they'll speak with Ewe, and then they'll speak Shwi, which is Asante. It's kind of like the trade language because the Asante are like 40% of the population of Ghana.
Okay.
And then they'll speak English. So, and then if they're close enough to the border, because the Ewe people are split between Togo, Ghana, and Benin, they'll also speak French.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. I imagine that could must make for some very interesting culture.
So I greatly enjoyed it. Of all the places I've taught, that had the best students because they have an exam for graduates of secondary education, and the top 10% of to go to the state university system, you have to be in the top 10% of the scores for that test.
Oh, really?
That year. Yeah. So and I was at the flagship university, although unfortunately, the next biggest university in Cape Coast, which was established later. So University of Ghana was established by the British in 1948. And Ghana got its independence in 1957. But the university was still part of the University of London until 1961. And so Cape Coast was established under the first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who was president from 1957 until his overthrow by the military in 1966. So I want to say the university was officially opened in 65, the year before he was overthrown. But I know it was established by him. But for some reason, they managed to overtake us in history. And then the department fell apart because almost all of the foreigners first left, and then they lost some of their Ghanaian. Well, I'm not sure if they lost any Ghanaian, but I do know most of the foreigners left. So after I left, there was just one permanent foreign faculty member, and I'm not sure if she's still there or not.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I had a graduate course I taught on the history of ethnicity, race. I think it was history of ethnicity and race. And that class was for master's students mostly. And I had 3 of those go on to PhD programs in the U.S.
Really? Oh, wow.
Now, I'm not sure.
Good.
One of the students I know went to University of Wisconsin, where he finished his PhD and then got a postdoc at Rice. Another one went to Georgetown, and she graduated, but I'm not sure where she's at now. So she got a
sounds
PhD
like pretty
in
decent
business.
pedigree to me.
And the third one was actually an American black nationalist, and she had a master's degree in writing from Brown University. So her English was very good, which is, I can't say for all the Ghanaians. Sometimes it looked like they were using English vocabulary and African grammar.
Okay.
All right. So, as you know, different languages have different grammatical structures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so if we were to use English words and German grammar, all the verbs would be still at the end. This is kind of one of the problems I had. I'm sure it was grammatically correct in whatever African language it was supposed to be, but the English didn't quite. So one of the it wasn't one of my students, but one of the PhDs I had to be a outside reader for. But anyway, so this American black nationalist, she was writing her dissertation on Garveyites. We already mentioned Margaret Garvey from Barbados, who went to Liberia in the 1920s. And so she took my class, and she did very well in it. We disagreed on many things, but she was quite smart. And she didn't like, for reasons I can totally understand, the administration at the University of Ghana, because it's basically a political position filled by an asshole. But
I don't find that entirely surprising.
if that, when you have patronage, who's connected to which political idiot. Uh, but so she transferred to Howard University, primarily because the Civil War in Liberia destroyed all of the newspapers there. And so the only complete collection, particularly from the 1920s, which she was interested in, collection of Liberian newspapers, because it was basically a clone of the U.S., but black, was at the Library of Congress, which is not too far from Howard University. So she went there, and then she wrote to me while I was in Iraq and asked me to write her a letter for the Frederick Douglass Fellowship, which paid for everything for 3 years. And she did get that, but she wasn't finished yet. And she asked me to write another letter for Ford Foundation, and she did not get that. And I have no idea what happened, but after that, but she was doing a PhD at Howard. But I do know the two Ghanaian students, one woman, one man. He got his PhD from the University of Wisconsin and then did a postdoc at Rice. And she finished her PhD at Georgetown, but I don't know what she did afterwards.
I'd say you've got a pretty good track record there.
Well, maybe.
As far as the higher end of things.
Yeah, well, three students, I guess, is better than no students. But I have the feeling, particularly the guy who went to Wisconsin, you could have dropped him because of his individual temperament, out in the middle of the Sahara, and say, here's the way to the library in Timbuktu. Let me know when you're finished with the dissertation, and it would turn out good. But interesting enough, I'm not going to give away his identity anymore, but this guy, one of his ancestors was from Prussia, and his name is one of the with a von in it. Very, very Germanic sounding name. All three of them.
Oh, that's cool.
But the European ancestry, of course, was so far back that he doesn't look mixed at all. He looks like he's 100% African, but he wrote his master's dissertation actually on the mixed race population during the pre-colonial era, during the slave trade era. So particularly you would have people sent from Denmark. They had they had a Osu slave castle, and then Quetta was a slave fort that shipped slaves to the Virgin Islands. And they would take an indigenous wife. And then so you would have the mixed race children would become kind of these merchants that had 1 foot in the world of Europe and one on the coast of Africa and 1 foot in the interior of Africa, could facilitate the trade of goods, including a large number of slaves.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, it amazed me that the approach to slavery is very different in Ghana than in the U.S. And I can't really say because it wasn't an expertise of mine that what I had picked up earlier was accurate. But the first thing is that the Atlantic slave trade was only one of many slave trades, and it actually wasn't the biggest.
Oh, no.
There was a slave trade much longer and larger to North Africa and the Middle East.
Never minding
slave trade
holds
across
the
the
largest
Indian
slave market
Ocean
in the world today.
to Bengal. So yeah, but we're talking before the Portuguese arrived in Elmina, which was in the 15th century. So the Arabs were already heavily involved in trading sub-Saharan African slaves from basically sub-Saharan slave kingdoms like the Asante, based in Kumasi, the second largest city in Ghana.
Or, ironically enough, they made a woman king movie just recently about one of those individuals.
Well, yeah, you do have the idea of women kings who are not queens in West Africa, and from what I understand of it is they are generally widows of the king who are forced then to take his position politically. So what happens is while they are biologically women, in terms of their political position, they are considered to be men.
Yeah, that would track. That makes sense. I mean, based on my understanding of how rigid some of those cultural norms are, especially the more ancient you get too. Like without a lot of older cultures to book.
Right. So this is why when the Asante and the head of the Asante, they call it Asantehene, which literally means head of the Asante. So they don't use the term king, but basically it would translate to that in a general sense. But when they first met the British, which is of course after the Portuguese and after the Dutch, they said, "Oh, this was under Victoria. Your king is a woman." Right? They didn't use the term queen.
Oh, sure.
So they have a term called Omahini, and the Omahini is basically the mother of the Asantehene, and it's a matrilineal society, but not a matriarchal society. That is, power is passed down on the mother's side, but the Asantehene is generally a man. I'm not sure if there's any cases where the Asantehene was a woman, but there are other cases in West Africa of women kings.
Interesting. Well, I've gotten a lot of interesting questions and topics out of you tonight. So, is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap it up, or anything you'd like to ask me for that matter?
I don't. Well, okay. That fake guy Dan.
You can call me Evan.
Evan. Okay. So I'm gonna be honest. I'd never heard of you before this invite, but I didn't have anything else to do, so I figured it wouldn't hurt.
Well, I have to say I appreciate you giving me the time. It's been a fun little conversation.
So you run a channel that focuses on geopolitics?
Geopolitics, science that's not getting the coverage it should get, dissident science, a touch of entertainment.
Dissident science.
Yes, sir.
Can you give me an example of that?
The most recently revealed numbers showing that the climate isn't changing at the pace we've been led to believe for the past decades.
Okay, but it's still bloody hot here.
Oh, sure. Not to say that it's not changing. It's just that perhaps it's not anthropogenic.
Yeah, well, okay.
But, that's one example. Another, perhaps, early on, we were big proponents of the lab leak theory involving COVID. And, well, as we've seen, that's largely proven itself to be the most feasible case. So, we oftentimes end up taking these, I wouldn't say adversarial positions, just, more willing to question the mainstream narrative of basically any scientific proposition. Like here on the show, we're huge proponents of nuclear energy, and it's only just now starting to get people interested again. I mean, look at Germany, for instance. They had an excellent program for decades, and now these climate alarmists have taken everything from this genuinely green program, and not only are they now burning coal, they're burning the dirtiest coal.
Yes, the brown coal.
Yeah. I mean, it's asinine. I will say that with No, no hesitation.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, okay. But not a lot of history, huh?
Not at all. Not at all. That's why this has been really fascinating. We're generally current events, and the kind of history we cover is going to be relatively recent and more than likely just to give context to the kind of topics we're covering.
Mhm.
So this has been a fun little
Well, I
adventure.
mean, there is a theory I see all the time, and I actually think it's largely true, that because of the way the current political international order was set up, that historically you need to revise the general narrative going back to at least the 30s and 40s, but probably even a little bit further. I mean, minimum perhaps starting with World War One, but certainly the kind of almost super Wilsonian moral narrative of the good crusading
American exceptionalism,
non-imperialist
if you will.
empire of the United States. That's kind of, I think, a bulwark of the current policies, particularly
In
in
its way,
places like Ukraine.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I'd say it's a funhouse mirror version of the same, but I would say that it draws its roots from that very same place.
Right. So, I mean, you kind of almost have to go back, and it's a kind of strange thing, is because there's like a big switch that occurred in my life. At one time, the major were challenged to this kind of moralistic crusading narrative came from the far left, where they would point out, the misdeeds of the United States and particularly organizations like the CIA. And then it somehow totally flipped that the left decided that all those things were good and great and wonderful, and it was only the enemies of the United States, like National Socialist Germany, that did bad things.
Oh, that's right. That's right. It was the Nazis that were bad. Now, if we run into any modern Nazis, we'll just gloss over that.
But have you noticed? Where is the left wing protest of U.S. military intervention, U.S. Support of horrible regimes like
Oh,
the one in Kiev,
it's gone the way of the dodo. I have to say,
right?
the
But from
most.
somebody who was around in the '80s, that's very bizarre.
I
Like,
don't disagree at all. I remember when Rage Against the Machine was Rage Against the Machine, and now I've seen. I mean that's just one example, obviously, and kind of an incredibly public one. But these same people that were anti-war, anti-establishment, anti-corporation to be backed by
right?
Coca-Cola
And
and
they also were
Unilever. It's
anti multinational corporation as well as interventionist foreign policy, and that went away real big too.
Yeah, yeah. It's like we love our corporations, we love our big government, and I know they've always loved the big government, but it's like I thought you guys wanted the government to do the things that you're asking the corporations to do now, in addition to the government. It's all
Yeah.
so very strange and flipped on its side. We've seen a real reversion of the roles too. To see the staunch left people saying no, you can't say these things; they hurt people, and the folks on the right saying no, you've got these folks. They've got the right to say what they want, even if it offends the Christians. It's such an inversion that we've found ourselves in. I don't disagree at all.
Yeah. So, and I find it kind of bizarre, but I suppose it was all never principled for many of these people with just whose ox was being gored. So if they had the power, then it was fine. It's only because they viewed themselves as outsiders in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to some extent. And once the 90s and to where we are now with the consolidated power, it's another story.
It's quite the thing to see. You know, I knew a bunch of punks when I was a kid. Never much was into the scene, but now I'm punk rock, and these guys are establishment. It's the world has grown quite silly, sir. Quite silly indeed.
Yeah. So, so I think almost need to have history to kind of like challenge the mythology.
Oh, of course.
Particularly when it comes to geopolitics, but also other things. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I brought up how slavery is treated very different in Ghana. So in Ghana, there are multiple slave trades, but there's also domestic slaves. So there's a law is that you can't bring up somebody's being descendant of slaves in Ghana, even though it's about half the population. That's considered like a violation. So they've kind of just basically decreed that everybody, regardless of whether their ancestors were slaves or whether they were slave owners in what was the Gold Coast, that now they're all legally equal Ghanaian citizens, although under tribal law, right, they have this kind of like parallel traditional law for the kings and chiefs.
Sure.
There's still discrimination against descendants of slaves. So they can't hold certain positions or inherit certain things. Mostly land, legally all land in Ghana is owned by chiefs and kings, not private individuals.
Similar to the caste systems of India, then that though they don't
more
exist.
similar to Great Britain, where everything is owned by lords and you just lease it for 100 or 200 years.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Officially under the secular republic established by Nkrumah, right, all Ghanaians are equal, regardless of ethnicity and regardless of the status of their ancestors, whether they were slaves or slave owners. But in the traditional ethnic governance for the various tribal organizations, there is still rights are reserved for people descendant of slave holders, not former descendants of slaves.
I could see that. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Right, but in some sense, I think that at least the republic's position, right, is a better one than the United States have, where you just basically keep opening the wound over and over again. So people who, right, many generations after the last slave has died, I think the last one died out in maybe the late 40s, early 50s. Right. So there hasn't been anybody in my lifetime that was a slave in the United States legally.
No, it's been quite some while since.
Right. But it keeps getting brought up, the people born in the, as recently as the 1980s and beyond are somehow, supposed to be furious that their ancestors were slaves. Whereas in Ghana, it's like the issue is closed, right? You are now all equal citizens. It doesn't matter what happened before the British abolished slavery in the Gold Coast.
Yeah, the past is the past. Leave it there. That's not necessarily bad advice. Probably save us a lot of squabbling that we're dealing with these days.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways before, before I left the United States for the second time, why I didn't come back for a long time. So that would have been 2007. I didn't get back till 2019. for any length of time. So in 2007, I left for Kyrgyzstan. I think after that time, probably the election of Obama in 2008, it actually was a deterioration of race relations in the U.S. from what it had been
I can't disagree
earlier
with
in
you.
my life.
No, that is largely, in my feeling, the demarcation line. Maybe
Yeah.
not
So
right there, but right around there. We saw so many good works just utterly undone.
I mean, maybe it's because I was a child, but I don't remember the 70s being as acrimonious across the black and white color line in the U.S. as it became later. And in the 80s, it seemed things were doing pretty well for the kind of growing black middle class. That the real problem wasn't so much conflict between whites and blacks, but the fact that there was kind of a core black underclass that was not amenable to government programs to eliminate it as an underclass.
That's fair.
I mean, obviously, so uh, right, but that situation it wasn't. It didn't seem to me that there was as much animosity back in 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
No, I
Not
would
50
say that
years ago. Yeah,
animosity had
50,
been.
40, 30 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I would agree. At least in my experience, like as a tiny child in the '80s, I would say that I it felt like a lot of those grievances were actually being talked out and resolved. And by the time I was maybe beginning to be cognizant of these things in the '90s, it seemed like we were actually at a point where we were having the conversations and we were having that forgiveness and moving on and actually building something better. And then, you know, some towers came down and everybody was together. And then not too long after, things got real weird because we needed somebody to continually hate.
Well, I'm kind of. I told you one of my graduate students was a black nationalist from the U.S. when I was working in Ghana, and I think they have a point in that white Americans and black Americans, because not because of skin color, but because of different historical experiences, are really different nations. We've formed different national characteristics as a result of different historical experiences. And so even though black Americans and white Americans are in the same state, right, we're not anymore the same nation than, white Americans and Mexicans. Now, it doesn't mean we have to have a hostile relationship with them, but it does mean that we can't just say, the differences of 400 years of history, let's just forget that they exist. I'm not making a judgment on this,
Oh,
but
sure.
I think that we divided for so long, differently historically and culturally, that we really have to think of it as two different nations. And how we could live in one state or whether it should be something else is something I'm not smart enough to deal with, right? But I don't think it has to be hostile any more than I'm hostile towards people who come to this country from elsewhere. But I do recognize that just as the Cuban and the Nicaraguan I work with are different people of different nations, right? Black Americans are a different nation too. It's just that that nation evolved within the U.S. state, but the history and culture is still quite different.
I think, and I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but I think that a lot of that, and there's a lot more nuance to my own opinion on this, but I think a lot of that is that state and that culture was never actually fully allowed to develop of its own. And because of that, that's caused a lot of the degeneration of black society in America. That, well, external factors as well. I'll be completely honest. I think the intelligence agencies have quite a lot to do with the destruction, dissolution of black society in America, starting roughly the late '40s. But you know.
Because they didn't like this idea of perhaps there'd be a secessionist movement because black intellectuals had decided that yes, they were a separate nation and should kind of develop on their own.
I honestly couldn't speak to
Well,
any of the
the only
conditions.
people I've like have been able to have like honest, in-depth conversations with us on that side. Of course, there are very few honest black nationalists, but that's their point of view. But it does kind of make an intrinsic sense, right? That they concluded that historically and culturally they're different, and therefore they should, have their own rule separate from the majority population.
Well, there's a bit of a compelling argument in that, and if given the opportunity, we might have seen something really special develop, but that never happened.
Well, granted, for a number of reasons, but I'm just saying that I think that the one of the root causes and why it seems intractable in the U.S. is because it's not a matter of there are Americans who just happen to have white skin and there are Americans who just happen to have black skin. It is that the history and culture, despite the common state, but it also has differences with state treatment of the two groups, is such that they've diverged. Well, they weren't. They diverged. They diverged in ways that didn't allow them to merge into one. So you have very culturally disparate groups in the beginning, and despite acculturation, there's all these other factors developing differentials.
I don't disagree with that, but I personally feel that a lot of that has been artificially driven by third parties.
I think the animosity is, but I don't think the differentiation is. So,
personally, I would actually say both. Not entirely on the differentiation. That's just going to be a natural cause of events, but
right. But I think a lot of people look at it as like race is skin color or race is genetics, where I think the main difference is actually historical between black Americans and white Americans. That I'm not sure how it would happen, but it might have been possible. You have situations like in the Middle East, where you have a black Arab population that is not really considered that different because they speak Arabic and they're Muslims, and the only real difference actually is skin color, whereas in the U.S., you could name a whole bunch of other differences, both historically and culturally.
And you can almost draw a dividing line somewhere after the 60s or in the 60s. I really think that there was a a direct and extended effort to basically drive a wedge between white and black societies in America. That's been.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but again, as I said, it can be done because they're already different. Now, different doesn't mean we have to be hostile.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that.
Obviously, we can be separate nations and have amicable relations. Unfortunately, for a whole variety of reasons, that hasn't panned out in the post-Civil War era after the abolition of slavery. But my hope still is that there could be in the future at least as good a relations as we had during my childhood. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it seems that it got worse.
I'll tell you what, I'd love to see it get back to where we were in the 90s. That was a good place.
That would be, I think, an improvement.
That was a pretty darn good place. We were all just honestly trying to get along and actually making a point of it. Back when Bill Nye told us there were only two genders too. Oh my!
I am.
Of the days in which we find ourselves.
I don't understand that. I'm not even going to pretend to. And
that's probably the right answer.
Maybe just because I'm just an old guy with my own prejudices and whatnot. But I just kind of one of those things that came out of like nowhere. That's very bizarre and strange, and maybe it is just 100% prejudice. But I have like an uncanny valley experience every time I see one of these trans women, especially if they have the 5 o'clock shadow.
No, that's actually reasonable. That's the part of you that's human that's screaming out at this thing that is.
And you know, like if I see an obviously gay guy, it doesn't bother me in nearly the same way because it doesn't appear that he's trying to hide anything.
Right. Yeah, it's.
Whereas this is a man who's trying to be a woman but didn't even shave.
Yeah. What's your game here? What are you at? You know, it raises questions that may or may not have answers. And sometimes the answers aren't the kind of thing you want to know. So, yeah.
No. I just being honest here that I find it it's bizarre to the point of being disconcerting on a gut visceral level.
I don't find that unreasonable at all.
Whereas as for most people, I'm pretty tolerant, especially if the only thing I have to go on is physical appearance. It's just, one of those things. But yeah, that wasn't the thing. When I was in college in the 80s, the big thing still was acceptance and tolerance of homosexuals that were out of the closet. But they weren't even talking about gay marriage back then. They were just talking about, we should allow them
These
to
people should be allowed to
openly
live
declare
their
their sexual orientation in public.
Yeah, they shouldn't have to live in fear. Well, I don't disagree with that. That's one of my.
I think we were beyond the living in fear part.
We're well past that.
No, I'm talking about in the 80s even. I mean.
Oh, okay, yeah. No,
I think we were getting into the.
We need to accept these folks for how they are and let them.
We need to accept them without any judgment. Is basically where it was. I think in the late 80s and early 90s. So. Because the idea of tolerance doesn't mean you necessarily approve of it. It just means that you are not going to
no, that's you.
Take coercive measures against it.
That's your thing. As long as you're not hurting me and mine, then you do your thing. That's basically how it was. You know, something I've actually said on this show in the past.
But I don't think there was. I mean, I'm not going to say rule out, but I don't think particularly. By the late 80s, there was much real discrimination against homosexuals. So, I mean, there might have been some areas where they wanted to be more discreet about it, but there certainly were places like New York City and San Francisco where your employer and your landlord and everybody else did not care if you were a flaming, flamboyant homosexual living in Castro. It just wasn't an issue anymore.
Sure. Well, as I was saying, like we've said on this show, it's okay to be weird. It's okay to not be normal. That is a thing, though. There is normal, and there is not weird. But just because you're not that, just because you're not the 95%, that's okay. It's perfectly fine to be weird. That doesn't mean you're better. But it also doesn't mean you're worse.
Right, but now we're into just weird, strange territory. Because as I said, the openly flamboyant male homosexual doesn't bother me he's just in the way. It doesn't actually bother me if he's not. Doing anything non-normal, I guess, in public.
Yeah, but if you're not harming anyone.
Right. I mean,
whatever.
But the very existence of the trans woman with the 5 o'clock shadow, they said, I find disconcerting in the uncanny valley way. It's like, is that a mannequin or is that a human? It's like, is that a man or a woman? It's.
Well, not only do I not disagree with you, I think that I think that that is not only natural but should be encouraged, because if the individual wishes to present as this thing, they should make every effort to do so. Should they not? Like, if you want to look like a woman, why are you going to, you know?
Well, this is what I don't know because I mean, it's um, and the other thing, because I had the discussion with my mother, is that when you're right about normal, and so both normal in terms of what is the norm in terms of biological reproduction, and also the majority of the population, right? Heterosexual, I guess the word they use, the opposite of trans is cis, right? It seemed to me that like your normal male homosexual is not nearly as deviant from that norm as the trans women, or I guess what you call it. That there's a less deviation from the norm.
Sure, that doesn't seem unreasonable. But, yeah, because, I mean, what is normal, right, at the end of the day?
Well, the norm is your, heterosexual cis person, but I mean, both in terms of, as I said, not only the majority, but I mean, the population ceases to exist if everybody's a homosexual or a transsexual. So,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
obviously, there are strong evolutionary reasons why these have always been small minorities in human history.
Yeah,
But I
what
just
is it,
think
3%
the
and
deviation now
0.05?
is so much greater, even than it was in the 1980s. And people talk about the 1980s as being repressive, but we had bands like Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Elton John, had come out of the closet, and nobody cared. The only one place it was an issue was Rob Halford, and that's because the kind of macho image of metal, and Judas Priest being one of the original gangster British metal bands. But even he eventually came out of the closet, and his fans said, "Well, who cares?"
Yeah, well, to be fair, with Judas Priest, it was a bunch of there was a lot of fans that said, "Yeah, we knew, Rob. It's okay. We just didn't say anything because you didn't either." But yeah, you do make a good point there. The original leather daddy, Rob Halford.
Well, actually, that's where he got that from. He got it from.
Oh yeah, drew it from the scene. Yeah, it's
Yeah. Well, Soho is a district in London, and it's right over on the west side by the theater district. But it's where you had, when I was there, they had legal prostitution there.
mm-hmm.
So prostitution was legal, but pimping was not. So you didn't have brothels, but you had these walk-up flats that just. So you'd have one or two women in each building, and they would pay a huge daily rent to a landlord, but he wasn't a pimp because the money was actually going to the individual prostitute. So, but also in that same area was where you had all the gay bars and fetish stores. So, and I guess it's kind of coexistence for quite some time in that region of London. But supposedly Rob Halford got all the leather with the spikes and whatnot, and including the whip, right? This kind of motorcycle hat. He got that from a gay leather fetish store in Soho, London.
that is a completely believable and funny story.
And there are clues in some of the lyrics of he writes that he's taking the piss out of his audience. That he's dropping the clues that he's not straight, but
well, he's hell bent for leather, right?
yes, that's the main song that deals with that. But again, after he came out of the closet, nobody cared. So it's not as if this type of paranoid, projection that normal society is obsessed with persecuting homosexuals and other people who deviate from the norm.
Yeah, it kind of shined a light on this. There's everyone's going to be so mad at you, or you're going to be gay bashed here or there. There are any number of the other things that we really in the early and middle '90s saw a lot of that dispelled, and then in the late '90s, just kind of it all fell apart. We had Ellen had her first kiss on whatever, and it was supposed to be a big deal, and it was just kind of a nothing burger. And it all just kind of a lot of these long held narratives just kind of fell apart in that time, and unfortunately, they've all been built back up in record.
Yeah, because realistically, I'm not going to say closet because that kind of implies that it's being hidden. But like, if it's not made a public issue, right? So if they just, if most people, including the minority that is gay, keep their sexual life private, most people just don't care what other people do. If it's their private sphere, it's their private sphere.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a very common belief, at least in the West.
No, I think that's true in the United States for the most part, and has been at least for 30 years now.
Sure.
All right. So all this kind of, reference to prejudice and bigotry is kind of it's totally, I think, misplaced, because what people think is not the issue; it's what people do.
Sure.
Right, and I guarantee you that in most places where these populations live, you would be very hard pressed to find evidence that somebody said, "Well, I suspect he's a homosexual, therefore I'm gonna have him blacklisted from being a state civil servant or something." I don't think that's happened in a very long time.
No, not at all. It's basically a complete non-issue at this point. You would stand a greater chance of not getting the job because you were straight.
That might be true. I mean,
it's
I don't know the rules here, but I mean, it does seem that in all the cases where you have either racial or sexual minorities, that you have an activist group that tries to play up this idea of persecution based largely not on current acts, but on historical acts, maybe the continuing prejudices of some of the population. But again, it's very little, I think, in terms of concrete discrimination in recent times.
No, that's valid. That's valid. A lot of what is the what's the term I'm looking for? Well, the identity politics grift. There's a term for it, but it escapes me at the moment. But yeah, there's you wonder sometimes if these people are in it for the money or if they actually care. And I kind of think it's a little bit more the money than actual concern. Especially in America. I mean, we had fixed so many of these issues. Grievance politics. That's what I was looking for. Grievance politics.
But again, I was gone for most of this time, and
blissfully unaware.
Well, I mean, I've seen the beginnings of it. I mean, obviously, I was telling already when I started college in '88. The big thing was "quote unquote" gay rights, but it wasn't. What I said, they were beyond the right stage by then by a considerable margin. It wasn't as if there was segregation or
Like, yeah, we've got a wall off
slavery
San
or
Francisco and
lynching
put them all
against
there,
any
something
group.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, so I mean, but I suppose the way the U.S. kind of got reset up in the '60s, the way to political power is to have grievances.
Seems to be, and that is to all of our detriment, I would say. I mean, even the grievance politicians, at the end of the day, I mean, they have to argue how bad things are and not how good they are, how good they could be. Just that we've got to fix these ancient grievances. And we've always got to fix some new grievance, because if there's not a grievance, there's no more grievance politics. You don't have problems, no problems to fix. So just like government programs, you've got to justify that funding. Well, we fixed all the problems. Well, you better find some more.
Well, true, but I suppose I'm much less sympathetic to libertarianism than I was 30 or 40 years ago. It seems to me that
that's fair. That's very fair. There have been a great deal of allowances by the libertarians.
Yeah, but I mean, also the question to be asked is free to do what? All right, so you free choice, but what are you going to do with that?
It's just how far does that extend, and what exactly do you mean it to extend to? Are you? Does your freedom infringe on others?
Well, even if it doesn't, though, I mean, I think the question still has to be asked.
Does your freedom at the end of the day degenerate society by nature of what it endorses? Perhaps. There's important questions to ask in any of these things.
That too. I was thinking more along the lines. I mean, on a more personal level. Right. So, I mean, certainly. But yeah, I think ultimately, kind of maybe it goes down to degeneration. So if, like, you as a parent choose not to discipline your child, right, then the child disrupts the classroom. We can kind of have some knock-on effects here from your freedom of choice.
Indeed, and that's affecting those other children who may have wanted to learn, but they just don't have that opportunity now, or any number of other things. Every action has its consequence, simply put.
Yeah. So, but on the other hand, I'm not exactly sure how you would reinstitute discipline anywhere in the U.S. at this point.
Well, sir, I think you actually did say it yourself, and I'm in complete agreement.
What?
We homeschool our kids.
That will help. I don't think it would solve it.
It's not a solution to the problem, but, if you can have a contingent of people that understand the way things ought to run, well, at least maybe they can carry that out further into the public. It's something, at least. It's better than nothing.
Okay, all right. But I was thinking more. I don't have any solutions, but it seems to me that it's kind of overemphasis on individualism, I guess the best way to put it. It's kind of overemphasis on the idea of
the self. Well, selfishness.
Yeah.
To put it simply. Yes.
Of democratic rule, a kind of knee-jerk reaction against all forms of authoritarianism is not. It's gotten to the point where it's no longer just socially useful.
Indeed. I don't disagree at all. As a matter of fact, I will say something incredibly acerbic, and Probably not off-putting, but maybe to some. Bring back bullying. Bring back bullying. It has its place. It, I mean, it's harsh, to be sure, but it allows people to understand that there are societal orders. Perhaps you want to overthrow the bully and be the great hero. And then you can be. Or perhaps, you'll learn that there are just shitty people that are going to do terrible things to you. You either have to get away from them, overcome them, or figure some solution. Without adversity, what are we?
Well, I mean, yeah, it just seemed to me, and again, this is one of the difficulties of being a historian, but this is impersonal, is that that despite being obviously nostalgized, I guess, viewed through rose-colored glasses, the all of the indications from talking to older people, many of them now dead from old age, including my grandparents, is that we've been on kind of a downward trend for quite some time, but things were pretty good until about the mid-'60s, and then the decline starts. And then, as I said,
I don't disagree.
Probably somewhere around 2008, it just accelerates.
I find that a very reasonable assessment, actually. That sounds about right, based on what I know. And I honestly think that ties into the intelligence agencies starting to get involved in far more than intelligence.
Well, they always were, at least since the founding of the CIA under Eisenhower, coming out of the OSS.
So certainly. But the 60s is such a perfect example because, so many of the movers and shakers of that time were directly connected to intelligence, whether the sons and daughters or, directly trained underneath of these individuals. Frank Zappa being such a perfect example of that, the agent gone rogue, as it were. And then his untimely death.
I thought he died of prostate cancer.
Well, he did. It was, I need to look back into that. From what I understand, it was very fast acting and caught him a little off guard. Much the same way that Bob Marley's cancer caught him very off guard.
Well, actually, I don't think the cancer caught Bob Marley off guard. He just refused to have the toe amputated because of his Rastafarian beliefs. So the tumor was there, and he refused to let them amputate the toe, and then it metastasized and killed him. Right? But obviously, a toe can be cut off if there's a tumor on it, and you can survive without a problem. But if you're unwilling to have the toe cut off, then the tumor is going to spread.
Sure enough.
But I don't know enough about Frank Zappa's demise.
And I have to be honest. A lot of this is based on secondhand information I've been given, so I can't speak from any kind of area of authority. Just hearsay.
Right.
And I have to be honest about that. Fair's fair.
Okay. So, but I do know that Marley died of metastasized skin cancer. Started with his toe, and if the toe had been cut off, he would have easily survived. But he refused to allow that because the Rastafarians are opposed to any type of amputation.
I would have to take your word for it. I don't know enough about Rastafarianism to actually say. That sounds right, but I just haven't done the studying to actually say for sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's what I've gotten from the few.
Yeah, I do know that
biographies of Bob Marley I've read.
Treatable. But
especially if you just can cut the toe off. Yeah. Just cut the toe off.
Right. Yeah. You could certainly get by without one of them. But
right.
Yeah. I have heard
I
some compelling arguments that perhaps this his cancer was maybe a little engineered. I don't know. I don't know. I'm willing to entertain these things. Why not?
uh, I hadn't heard that, but
But who could say? I mean, it's all in the past anyway. I mean, at this point, it's kind of all conjecture, other than the actual medical people that were involved in the treatment and perhaps development of whatever nonsense that may or may not have happened. So, I guess it's just a fun aside at this point. Either way, though, we do oftentimes lose these incredibly useful people that are doing good in the world. So, whatever.
okay.
And I think I'm getting into the rambling territory.
All right.
I've got about all the topics I had wanted to cover. And was there anything else you'd like to get to tonight before we call it a wrap?
No, I think it's been going on enough, and
I have to say I've had an excellent conversation. It's been a good time. It's been a pleasure. Incredibly informative, and I have a feeling that a number of my audience members will be giving you a follow and probably checking out some of your work. I'll again make sure to include the links to both your social media and all of your books down below for anyone who's going to be checking this out.
And I do have. I'll put it in my chat here. Just take a second, but I have a lot of my shorter academic work at this website here, Academia EDU. So I mean, most of these are journal articles. So if you're into the academic stuff, but you can look at it if I can find where I was. Okay. So I have put it in the chat there. But those are shorter pieces, mostly, as I said, from academic journal articles.
All right. Well, I will be glad to include that as well. And, anything else you want me to put in there, just DM me or whatever. I'll throw that in the show links for everybody. But that aside, it's been quite a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
All right. Thank you. And I'll probably catch you later somehow.
Undoubtedly. Have a very pleasant coming week, and don't clean too hard.
All right. Thank you.
Be well, sir. Be well. Been a pleasure.